In 1837, on Georgia's Piedmont, below the foothills of the Cumberland mountain range, a city was born, not on the shores of a great ocean or in the bend of a river as cities traditionally have come into being, but by the decision of one man. Stephen Long was a surveyor for the Western and Atlantic Railroad. It was his job to find a place for the railroad from Chattanooga to meet other lines from the east and south, a terminus. The little town of Decatur was the logical place, but the citizens didn't want the smelly, dirty railroad in their town, so he went west several miles and drove a stake in the middle of the woods for a railroad crossing. He was quoted as saying, "The terminus will be a good location for one tavern, a blacksmith shop, a grocery store, and nothing else." He couldn't have been more wrong. There was something about building a town from scratch that drew people like a magnet, and railroad people and people from up north began moving to the terminus. They named it Marthasville, after Governor Lumpkin's daughter, but soon Marthasville didn't seem like a good name for a growing, bustling town, so people started calling the town Atlanta.
Many of our pioneer citizens came from New England or Pennsylvania or New York State. So we have a diversified population, which means that we have a diversified business. We're not a one industry town like Birmingham maybe for coal or Akron, Ohio for steel and all that sort of thing. We don't have any one industry that monopolizes everything. William Ezard was one of the pioneer citizens. He was a lawyer by profession. The only man to serve as mayor of Atlanta before and after the Civil War.
Judge William Ezard was a Methodist and became a leader of the group which was forming.
Well, any city that hasn't got churches is not much of a city. And as the population increased here, need was felt by the various denominations, primarily Methodist and Baptist and Presbyterian, while at one time in around 1847, and back of that, why everybody worshipped at the same building.
The little building was in the triangle between Peachtree, Pryor, and Houston Streets. During the week it was a schoolhouse, and on Sunday a church. In that building on June 10, 1847, the Union Sabbath School was organized, the first real religious organization in Atlanta. Soon after that, the Methodists organized Wesley Chapel with 40 members. They raised $700 and built the first denominational house of worship in Atlanta, a 30 by 50 foot white frame building on the east side of Peachtree Street at what is now the north end of Woodruff Park. In December 1847, the same month Atlanta was incorporated, they worshiped in the building for the first time. There was no money for pews, so they made backless benches from scraps of wood donated by lumberman Jonathan Norcross, whose sawmill was powered by a team of blind horses. A rough platform and a small table were the only pulpit furniture, and a homemade tin chandelier lit the night services. On March 24, 1848, Wesley Chapel was dedicated by Bishop James Osgood Andrew. The foundation for the future of First United Methodist Church was being laid. In 1849, there was a great revival causing great growth in membership, and the church got comfortable pews. In 1850, Wesley Chapel raised $300 for a bell. It was too heavy to go on top of the church, so a separate bell tower was built. Atlanta now had a population of 2,500, and in 1854, jeweler and Wesley Chapel trustee Lachey got the assignment from the city council to design and engrave a city seal. He was paid $21. At the same meeting, the city council adopted an ordinance to keep hogs out of the street. As Atlanta grew, Wesley Chapel grew and established many mission churches. Trinity United Methodist Church of Atlanta began as a mission Sunday school of Wesley Chapel in 1853. Green B. Haygood was the promoter, assisted by his wife Martha and their son, who later became Bishop Atticus G. Haygood. Soon the congregation earned the title Mother Church of Methodism in Atlanta, because over a 30-year period it sponsored Evans Chapel, Paynes Chapel, St. Paul's, St. Mark, Park Street, Grace, and Asbury. Wesley Chapel also raised money so its 200 black members could establish the Atlanta Colored Mission, the forerunner of Big Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church on Auburn Avenue.
The population of Atlanta during the 1850s increased rather rapidly, and by 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, we had a population of, in round numbers, about 7,700.
War came to Wesley Chapel on January 19, 1861, when Georgia became the 5th Southern state to secede from the Union. Judge William Ezzard became captain of the Gate City Guard. Wesley Chapel member Robert Flournoy MADDOX put a closed sign in the window of his Atlanta grocery store and left his bride of only 1 year, Nannie Foster MADDOX, to become captain of the Calhoun Guards, part of the Army of Tennessee. Atlanta was second only to Richmond as a manufacturing center for the war effort. Wesley Chapel members Joseph and Isaac Winship had a machine shop and ironworks which became a prime center for the production of war materiel. Future First Methodist member Benjamin Harvey Hill of LaGrange went to the Confederate Congress in Richmond as senator from Georgia, although he had opposed secession. He reportedly had an active temper and once threw an inkwell at a fellow senator during a passionate debate. Many Atlanta churches became hospitals for wounded Confederate soldiers. Under the leadership of Mrs. Isaac Winship, Wesley Chapel began the Atlanta Relief Hospital Association. As might be expected, there was a revival among the troops stationed in Atlanta. The Atlanta Intelligencer newspaper reported that, quote, "At Wesley Chapel, the revival progresses with unabated zeal and interest, and accounts from various parts of the Army state that our soldiers are enlisting in great numbers under the banner of the Most High." Clement Anselm Evans of Lumpkin, Georgia, entered the Army as a private but rose to the rank of brigadier general. After the war, he entered the Methodist ministry and pastored First Methodist Church in the 1880s, when he used his military organizational skills to retire a large building debt. Evans and his wife Allie wrote many letters during the war.
My dear darling, thank God, my dear, for us both that I am still alive. Do not be uneasy when I tell you that I was again slightly wounded in the side, for it did not stop me but a few minutes. I have not left the regiment for it at all, and will in a few days be entirely well. The question of strength, skill, and courage is still to be tested. In him who rules all things well, we put our trust for victory. Do not forget, darling, to place all your trust in the good one and be resigned to his will, whatever may happen. Goodbye, and God bless, my darling, your husband.
As the war dragged on, raw materials became precious, especially metal. One by one, the church bells in Atlanta were melted down. It was decided that Wesley Chapel's bell should be preserved, so Atlanta would have some way of calling its citizens. A series of signals was devised, and the whole town could hear the bell when it rang.
And because there were manufacturing establishments in Atlanta that made everything the Confederate Army used, also 4 railroads served Atlanta in 4 directions. and it was just natural for the Union Army to want to get control of it.
In 1864, the Union Army under William Tecumseh Sherman laid siege to Atlanta after battling the Confederate Army across North Georgia from Chattanooga. On June 10, Mayor Calhoun declared a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer.
Before the Union Army captured Atlanta, they established big guns out near where the Fox Theater now is and lobbed shells into Atlanta. Nobody knew when a shell was going to fall.
Shea was crossing Ivy Street at Ellis when he noticed a father, mother, and young daughter walking along. Suddenly he heard a whirring sound and a whoosh above his head that was followed immediately by a loud explosion that stunned and deafened him. When the cloud of dust cleared, he saw the little girl face down in the middle of the intersection. She had been hit by the first shell to strike the city. She was the first casualty of the Battle of Atlanta. 3,000 Union soldiers and 6,000 Confederate men died on the first day of the battle. After fighting around Atlanta for more than 2 months, the defeated Confederate Army withdrew, and Mayor Calhoun surrendered the city on September 2. 10-year-old Wesley Chapel member Carrie Berry wrote in her diary as the Yankees entered the city.
We could not sleep because we were afraid the soldiers might set fire to our house. They behaved very badly, I thought, going around setting people's houses on fire. Wish I could go to school. We're having all holidays. I work at home and sleep if mosquitoes don't bite too much. Soldiers pace back and forth, but orderly. We are all in so much trouble. Mama is so worried. Papa doesn't know where to go. We had stewed chicken. It is a dark, rainy day. The last train has left. We are obliged to stay now.
And so Atlanta received more physical destruction than any city except Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederacy.
Wesley Chapel was not destroyed, but it was struck by shells several times and its records were lost. Someone said the church looked more like a hog pen than a house of God. Wesley Chapel's membership dropped to about 1/3 of what it once had been. But the war ended, and as Atlanta rose from the ashes, so did Wesley Chapel. By 1869, Wesley Chapel had grown to nearly 600 members once again. Soon Wesley Chapel outgrew its aging wooden building, and the congregation took on the ambitious project of building a grand new church, which seated 1,000. The cornerstone was laid next to Wesley Chapel in 1870. The name was changed to First Methodist Episcopal Church South. While the new church was being built, a tragedy nearly occurred. The unfinished steeple, which stood atop the 180-foot center tower, collapsed and crashed to the ground, just barely missing Dr. William P. Harrison, the pastor. In 1876, Alfred Holt Colquitt, a licensed Methodist minister and First Methodist trustee, was elected governor of the state of Georgia. At the end of his term, Colquitt was appointed to the United States Senate to fill the unexpired term of Benjamin H. Hill, also a First Methodist member, who had died in office. There Colquitt served until his death in 1894. In the late 1880s, Reverend Wilbur Fisk Glenn, for whom Emory University's Glenn Memorial Church is named, pastored First Methodist. He wrote a short but valuable history of First Methodist. One of Glenn's parishioners was probably the best-known member of First Methodist Church, Henry Woodfin Grady. As editor of the Atlanta Constitution, Grady popularized the term the New South, making many trips to the North as a popular orator.
And he made a trip to New England in 1889 to address a group there and caught a cold. And on the way back, the cold ran into pneumonia, and it took him off at the early age of 39.
Henry Grady's funeral was at First Methodist Church. Soon after his death, Grady's dream of a public hospital for Atlanta was realized. In 1901, First Methodist leadership decided to move out of downtown to 360 Peachtree Street, which at that time was in a nice residential area.
The houses were mostly two-story, first-class residences. Many of Atlanta's leading citizens lived in that immediate neighborhood.
Not everyone was in favor of the move. Some of the members objected to the new property because it was, quote, too far out in the wilderness. The minutes of a building committee meeting reveal that Bishop Warren Candler was there and vigorously opposed the proposed location as being too far from the center of the city. But after the bishop left, the committee voted to go ahead with the move. Ironically, it was the bishop's brother, Coca-Cola magnate Asa Griggs Candler, who bought the old Wesley Chapel and First Methodist site. He demolished the old church and built the Candler Building, which still stands on Peachtree Street today. Asa Candler bought the formula for Coca-Cola in 1873 for $2,300 and turned it into a multi-million-dollar company before selling it to the Woodruffs. Asa Candler's son, Asa Jr., and grandson, John, were both members of First Methodist Church. Pastor Charles W. Byrd led the church during the construction of the new building at 360 Peachtree Street. Since the contract called for immediate release of the old property, First Methodist worshiped in a tent on the corner of West Peachtree and Porter Place from April until December, when construction was completed. From the old church, the congregation took some of the organ pipes, which form the facade of today's organ, some of the stained glass windows, which occupy the stairwells, and Wesley Chapel's bell, which still rings from the church's bell tower every Sunday. In 1908, another First Methodist member became the mayor of Atlanta. Robert Foster Maddox, son of Robert and Nannie Maddox, a banker and county commissioner, was considered one of Atlanta's most progressive chief executives. For 72 years he was on the board of the First National Bank of Atlanta, retiring in 1964. He would serve on First Methodist's official board into his 90s. In 1961 he sold his magnificent Tudor-style mansion to the state of Georgia, and today the property is the site of the governor's mansion. Another faithful layman of First Methodist during the early 20th century was Robert A. Hemphill, president of Goodhart Tompkins Company and Southern Photo Material Company, and was on the board of the North Georgia Children's Home. He served on First Church's Board of Trustees for more than 42 years and was chairman for 10. He also chaired the Board of Stewards for 25 years. His name is memorialized by the Hemphill Rogers Sunday School class. In 1922, a First Methodist pastor became bishop of the North Georgia Conference. James Dickey served the church from 1916 to 1920. Before that, he had been president of Emory University for 13 years. By this time, First Church membership was 1,300, but the Great Depression reversed the church's growth for the first time since the Civil War. The business district, which the church had tried to leave behind in 1903, once again engulfed it, and potential members no longer lived nearby. First Methodist daughter churches had birthed so many grandchildren that there were 48 Methodist churches in Atlanta in 1939. First Church began shrinking. The church's planning committees voted to move the congregation to Buckhead. But Bishop Arthur J. Moore urged the church to stay where it was, much as Bishop Candler had tried unsuccessfully to do nearly 40 years earlier. He felt a church was needed in the Buckhead area, but downtown needed a church too. This time the leadership of the congregation listened to the bishop, deciding to stay downtown and radically change its program to remain a viable congregation.
But the Methodist denomination has been strong in Atlanta ever since there was any Atlanta. And I expect it'll stay that way, too. I rather admire their decision not to move the First Methodist Church somewhere else.
To revitalize First Methodist, Bishop Moore brought Georgia native Pierce Harris back home from Jacksonville, Florida in December 1940. Growing up in Rome, Georgia, Pierce Harris had played minor league baseball and was offered a contract with the Detroit Tigers. But he declined a baseball career to be a pastor, taking an appointment to the Chickamauga Circuit in 1919. Harris reinstituted the Sunday evening service at First Methodist, which had been stopped during the Depression, and many other programs. He became known far and wide for his folksy preaching style and whimsical newspaper columns.
There are not many things about my life that haven't been printed or spoken in a careless moment. Very few people know that I used to teach school. I don't mention it, rarely ever mention it. I didn't actually teach anybody, I just heard lessons. I taught history, didn't know any history, so that was bad. Everybody that comes to this church must have heard me say that, and I've got a scar to prove it, that there ought to be a federal law against putting a barbed wire fence around a watermelon patch. Well, there are a whole lot of things that you could decorate the story of your life. But actually the story of my own life really begins in a little church and under the influence of an inspired hour, walking down the aisle and giving my life to the Lord. I said recently over in Alabama that being a preacher, it's not a profession. If it is, it's the poorest profession there is. We got a lot of preachers here tonight. If you're preaching because you're a member of a great profession, you're in the wrong business. Now let me tell you what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to study harder than a school teacher. You're going to have to make more visits than a doctor. You're going to have to make more speeches than a lawyer. You're going to have more enthusiasm than an insurance agent. That's the limit in that field. You're going to have to have more enthusiasm than an insurance agent. You're going to have to know how to operate an adult nursery. You're going to have to be a financial wizard and a diplomatic genius. And in smaller churches, you're going to have to be an electrician and a mechanic. And then after you've done all these things, you're just getting started. You've got to know the way that leads from the cities of this earth to that city that has foundations whose builder and maker is God. And you've got to be good enough to lead the way.
Are you ready, everybody? Let's sing about it.
Harris hired Harry J. Armstrong as minister of music. The combination of Harris's camp meeting style preaching and Army Armstrong's gospel revival singing was just what was needed at that time. With war clouds on the horizon, people began to come downtown to church again. Soon the team of Pierce Harris and Army Armstrong were in demand across the country as revival speakers and to teach other pastors how to have a successful Sunday night service. Meanwhile, First Methodist membership continued to grow. In 5 years, active membership more than doubled to 2,000. And this growth took place during World War II. Reverend Charles W. Fruit also joined the staff during Pierce Harris's tenure to oversee the business matters of the church.
Dr. Wallace Rogers was one of the outstanding personalities in First Methodist Church. He was an associate pastor and also taught the Hemphill Sunday School class. Dr. Rogers had a wonderful sense of humor and always had great stories to tell. He was also a bird lover and made and collected beautiful slides of birds. Before he died, he gave these slides to Disney and to various friends.
In 1944, a post-war planning committee reported that the church's physical plant was inadequate and the Centennial Building Fund was established. A $500,000 expansion was begun as part of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of Wesley Chapel's dedication in 1948. December 31, 1965, Pierce Harris retired. During the 25 years of his ministry, the church's membership had doubled to over 2,400. First Methodist had developed many active programs, including strong Sunday school classes, many of which still carry on their long histories and traditions. Many members of First Methodist today still remember Dr. Harris fondly. He was replaced by Dr. Robert V. Osment.
You can't ignore your problems. They won't go away. They will not solve themselves. We have to solve them. Can't do everything, but I can do something. Someone said what you are is God's gift to you, but what you become is your gift to God. You see, through his power and through his love and through your faith. No person is immune from trouble. And no one is beyond the reach of God's grace. I want you to remember that. That the good and the bad, we know trouble. The good and the bad, everyone is within reach of the grace and the goodness of God. Jesus said, I've overcome mine. In the world you shall have tribulation, but remember, I have overcome, and you can overcome.
Together, Dr. Harris and Dr. Osment occupied the pulpit of First Methodist Church for nearly 1/3 of the congregation's history. Dr. Osment continued the tradition of camp meeting worship and music until his own retirement in 1989. During Dr. Osment's pastorate, other changes took place in the staff. George Holden replaced Harry Armstrong in 1966, and David Ogletree joined the staff in 1970. E.G. Hutchings replaced Dr. Fruit when he retired, and Carl Standard followed him in overseeing the church's business. During Bob Osment's tenure, television ministry would be added to the church's outreaches. But when Dr. Osment came to First Methodist, events were already developing which would again challenge the church as a viable downtown congregation. The intersection of Interstates 20, 75, and 85 near the state capitol opened in 1964. That same year, voters in the 5 metro counties approved a rapid transit system which became MARTA. These two developments made commuting from greater distances easier than ever before, and Atlanta's urban sprawl continued stretching out miles from the downtown area. The 1964 Civil Rights Act changed race relations in Atlanta, whose population was then half white, half black. The suburbs continued to grow as whites fled the central city. All these changes had serious ramifications for First Methodist Church. The church's membership peaked during the 60s at nearly 2,500. During the 70s, membership and attendance began to decline. From 1974, when average weekly attendance was 1,400, the numbers dropped rapidly. By 1984, attendance was 550. By 1990, average attendance figures had dropped to 350, where they stayed during most of the decade. Membership hovered around 1,000 into the late 90s. Baptisms fell from 49 in 1964 to 24 in 1974 and to 6 in 1984. Baptisms remained in the single digits most years of the 1990s. Meanwhile, annual deaths remained constant. 38 in 1974, 34 in 1984, and 35 in 1994, with most years averaging 30 to 35. In the 1970s, 21 of the church's stained glass windows were damaged by a vandal. It took a year to restore them. The windows, some of which were moved from the old church of the 1870s, have always been one of the most striking features of the building at 360 Peachtree Street. The dedications of the windows read like a who's who of Wesley Chapel and First Methodist Episcopal Church South. MADDOX, Winship, Hammond, Berry, Harrison, and Grady. The small windows at the Peachtree Street entrance were provided as memorials to Dr. and Mrs. Pierce Harris by the Women's Society of Christian Service and the Church Guild. In 1989, after Dr. Osment's retirement, Reverend Sam Matthews became senior minister.
Mary, who was greeted with that warning that upset her and upset her family and upset all who knew her, that she was to bear the Christ child. Hail, favored one, the angel said to her in Luke's account of the gospel. You've been chosen. Wonder how many times on that journey and how many times in the first few years of Jesus' life she wished that she hadn't been chosen. You remember the words of Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof after their little village of Anatevka has been destroyed by the Russian troops? Tevye looks up in his prayer, and he's the Jewish fellow, and he says, oh God, I know we're the chosen people, but once in a while, couldn't you choose someone else? Mary must have felt that way before that journey was finished. Couldn't you choose somebody else to bear this child and to enjoy this great gift?
Sam was a master of words, both written and spoken. He could take a headline or a byline or a sports story or a cartoon and make a good sermon out of it. He brought with him a certain level of sophistication to the pulpit. He was well versed in art, music, literature, as well as sports. And he made all of those things a real part of his sermons every week. He established the Acolyte program, and he also set aside a few minutes in every sermon or every service for the children. He also elevated the role of women in the church, having associate ministers of the female gender and giving them ample pulpit time. Sam left us with many wonderful quotes, but one of my favorite was one that he said one time in a sermon. He said, if I had only one thing that I could leave you with, one thought that I could leave with you, it would be kind to one another.
Fear not, I am with you, oh, be not dismayed, for I am your God.
Being a downtown church, we face many unique challenges and opportunities for ministry. As part of this outreach in 1993, First United Methodist joined 9 other congregations in a partnership to prevent homelessness and became a sponsor of the Midtown Assistance Center, or MAC. MAC was founded in 1986 as a collaborative effort of congregations along the Peachtree Corridor who realized that low-income working people had nowhere to turn in times of financial crisis. By pooling their resources, these congregations could more effectively meet the needs of the working poor. For the past 4 years, this outreach ministry has been located on the ground level of First Methodist and provides financial assistance in the form of rent and utility payments, transportation and groceries in more than 4,000 emergency situations a year. In addition to donating office space for the center, members of First Methodist participate as volunteers and board members.
First Methodist Church began its preparations for the Olympics in the winter of 1994 when we were approached by officials from the Salvation Army who had attended the Winter Olympics in Lillehammer, Norway. The churches there came together to offer cultural events and hospitality to the Olympic visitors, and we began a program called Celebrate Faith and Arts to do the same for Atlanta. Over 21 churches came together to offer cultural events and offer cups of cold water. Here at First Methodist, 2 groups were in residence, a group from the Norwegian Lutheran Church and a dance troupe from Hawaii. At any given time, about 50 people were living, sleeping, and eating here in our church, including my wife and myself, who lived in my office. The Olympics are gone, but the Spirit lives on, and Celebrate Faith and Arts continues to link our congregations together.
In June of 1997, Dr. Bob Allred became pastor of First United Methodist Church, being just the 4th pastor in almost 60 years.
Prayer. Hey, we pray about our own participation in the life of the church. If we're not excited about it, we need to get excited about it. For, oh, what a mission we have and what a joy it will be in times of discouragement, you need to remember and remember that vision of what God is going to do through the life of this great church.
1997 was a year of celebration as First United Methodist Church commemorated its 150th anniversary with numerous activities, including a heritage walk from the Candler Building to the church with special guest speaker and son of First Methodist, Dr. Sam Coker. Voices from the Past vignettes in the worship services, a Sacred Harp singing school, a homecoming, and many other activities. All year, the church was reminded that all that has gone before is the foundation for the future. While the past is fascinating and important, we must look to the future. War, depression, and urban blight have all hurt the church at various times, but always God has raised up someone, perhaps a pastor like William Harrison or Pierce Harris, or faithful laymen like Earl Lachey or Robert Hemphill, or John Hallman, or countless others which could be mentioned, who by their dedication and faith have moved the church forward. The spirit of Atlanta has always been optimism in the face of adversity, and First United Methodist Church has shared that spirit, just as it has shared the history of the city.